A CIA operation to fund insurgents directly led to the best-selling novel, 50 Shades of Grey. Wait, hold on. I promise I'm telling the truth. So there's a lot of moving parts here, so please just bear with me. So our story first begins in New Jersey on April 9th, 1977, when this American kid named Jared Way is born. We'll come back to him in a little while. Next, we go to Afghanistan. It's Christmas Day, 1979, and Soviet forces have just invaded. Now, you might be wondering how we got here, since we're kind of starting in the middle, so let's go back a bit. So, the Soviets and Afghanistan had essentially been good buddies since the 60s. The USSR had even become Afghanistan's main trading partner by this point. Following a communist takeover in Afghanistan in 78, Islamic fundamentalists had declared war on this new government. Being uber-communist and established buddies, the Soviet Union was inclined to help by sending in troops to help the communist government on Christmas Day, 1979. Okay, now that everyone's on the same page, we can now start to look at the CIA. So the CIA had been in the region for some time, but they were pretty much only watching the Soviets. They honestly didn't have much of a handle on pretty much anything Afghani. Now, a week prior to the invasion, the decision was made to create an operation to supply the fundamentalists opposed to this new communist government. This is where Operation Cyclone comes in. Now, really quickly, before we go any farther, can we just please acknowledge how badass of a name Operation Cyclone is? Like, say what you want about the CIA's dubious practices, they sure know how to give sweet names. Alright, back to the story. There is a lot of subtle nuances here that I am not qualified to go into at all. So instead, I will do my best to summarize the situation as it relates to the topic of this video. The CIA's mantra during this time could be thought of as intelligence scholar Dr. Hugh Dillon says, quote, "The enemy of my enemy is my friend," end quote. So, following this mantra, the CIA would fund really anyone who opposed the Soviets, including religious extremists. In fact, Station Chief Howard Hart's instructions were, quote, "Here's a bag of money, go raise hell." And raise hell he did. So what began as an operation supplying the Afghani fighters, known as Mujahideen, which means religious fighters, supplying them with simple rifles, would eventually turn into a highly complex operation, giving them machine guns and later highly specialized missile launchers, as funding and support for this operation grew dramatically. Now, it's important to the story that we do a little dissecting of this complex and frankly fucked harebrained scheme orchestrated by the CIA. So, in order to maintain the concept of plausible deniability, the CIA had to operate through a middleman, and the perfect candidate turned out to be Pakistani Inter-Services Intelligence, or simply known as the ISI. It's when we look at the CIA and ISI's relationship where things just get bizarre. In exchange for supplying equipment, ISI got full control over the coordination of the weapons flow. Now, a large portion of these guns wouldn't even go into Afghanistan. They often were sold on the black market for profit that could be used by Pakistan to combat India. In just one, frankly insane instance, Pakistani ISI actually managed to sell the CIA back their own weapons. So the ISI was also using this increased presence in Afghanistan to get involved in the heroin trade. This doesn't have much of an impact on our story, but I'm just going to lay it out for you so you realize how bananas this whole thing got. So just so we know, the American CIA is funding the Pakistani ISI, who are then funding the drug trade, a trade you might recall President Ronald Reagan declaring a war on during this time. So now the DEA is actively fighting against a drug trade that is partly being funded by the CIA. Anyways, back to Afghanistan. So when the ISI does bring the guns into Afghanistan instead of selling them, they decide who receives them. Now, recall the Mujahideen. Yeah, these guys aren't one group of unified fighters. The Mujahideen is just a catch-all name for those engaging in a religious war. The Mujahideen is composed of countless groups, all with differing ideologies, that just happen to be unified under a supreme hatred for the commies. Now, it's during this time where the ISI get this idea that the most fanatical religious zealots fight the best, and so they should be the ones receiving all the guns. That would be like the American taxpayers deciding that the military aren't hardcore enough to have cool weapons, and instead, political extremist groups should receive the cool missile launchers. It's not a perfect analogy, but you get my point. One of these hardcore zealots is this dude, Osama bin Laden, who, as I'm sure you know, will play a major role in this story. After graduating from university, bin Laden flew to Afghanistan to join the fight against the Russians. He mostly acted as a go-between between ISI and Mujahideen fighters to help coordinate the funding, although he did fight in a few battles. So, despite the supremely fucked up logistics of Operation Cyclone, the plan saw great success. This success is largely due to these high-tech missiles I mentioned before. They're called Stingers, and they're pretty much designed to shoot down helicopters. The introduction of these Stingers turned the war into what had pretty much become a stalemate into just an absolute disaster for the Red Army, who now had lost the only superiority they had left which was the air. The USSR would eventually be forced to withdraw its forces from the region. Oh shit. Sorry, wrong picture. This comes later. There we go. Not much thought was given to what might happen after the Soviets withdrew. Although CIA analysts did predict a religious government would come to power, and they even had known it might be one actively hostile to them, they really didn't care. A CIA officer bluntly speaking about the fate of one Afghani province speaks volumes of their attitudes towards the country as a whole, saying, quote, "Did we really give a shit about the long-term future of Nangarhar? Maybe not. As it turned out, guess what? We didn't." So, following the Reds leaving, the Afghanistan communist government fell dramatically fast, like way faster than anyone expected. This left a power vacuum that many Mujahideen groups, no longer unified under a single enemy, sought to fill. The country fell into a brutal civil war, one that would last until the mid-90s. The group that came out on top is one you might know, the Taliban, who, once they had consolidated power, quickly instituted oppressive religious reforms. Now, while all this was happening, bin Laden had returned to his home of Saudi Arabia. However, he became increasingly angry at the Saudi government as they had started to hang out with the US more and more. His anger boiled over when the Saudi government allowed US forces to enter the country after Iraq had invaded the bordering country of Kuwait in 1990. His constant complaining of the government led the Saudis to expel him from the country. And after a brief time in Sudan, he would find refuge in Afghanistan, where the now Taliban government would allow him to relax for a bit. Out of his now home base of Afghanistan, bin Laden would acquire funds by shaking the trees from his days fighting with the Mujahideen to help fund various terrorist attacks. All of these attacks would lead up to September 11th, 2001, where Al-Qaeda hijackers took control of a few commercial flights and flew them into several American targets. Two of these targets were the World Trade Centers of New York City. These attacks would lead up to September 11th, 2001, and that's where the story of this American kid, Jared Way, remember him, intersects with this tragic story of Afghanistan. Following an uneventful childhood, he had decided to pursue a career as an artist creating comic books. Working as an intern at the time, he was on his way into Manhattan on the morning of September 11th, 2001, when he saw the first plane hit the North Tower. Following this experience, he decided to change careers, telling Spin magazine in 2005, quote, "I literally said to myself, fuck art. I've got to get out of the basement. I've got to see the world. I've got to make a difference." From here, he would form the band My Chemical Romance along with drummer Matt Pellissier. The band would then grow to become hugely popular, with one of their albums achieving platinum status in 2005 while garnering a shit ton of fans. One of these fans was a writer named Stephanie Meyer. Meyer was heavily inspired by the band's music when writing a little-known book series called Twilight in 2003. The series would explode in popularity and was on New York Times bestseller list for 235 weeks in a row. The book series was even put in BBC's top 100 most influential books of all time. Apart from the books being massively popular. Like, one second, it's crazy how well known Twilight is, right? I've never even read one of the books, but I can confidently say I'm Team Jacob. Anyways, apart from the novels being massively popular, it also spawned a movie series starring this freak. Some lady named Erica Mitchell, going through a midlife crisis, saw these movies and was so hot and bothered she was like, fuck it. I'm going to write some kinky fan fiction so I can make others as horny as I am. This fan fiction proved to be so popular it became a series of its own, ditching the Twilight universe and instead being about a rich white kinky dude being into a kinky white girl who doesn't know she's kinky yet. So there we go. The CIA funded insurgents to fight the Soviet Union with little regard to what came after, which led to a radical government taking power in Afghanistan that allowed Osama bin Laden to coordinate his attacks. One of these attacks, 9/11, directly inspired My Chemical Romance frontman Jared Way to start his band about chemicals going on dates. Then directly inspired Twilight writer Stephanie Meyer to write a hugely popular Twilight series that spawned movies, which inspired horny writer Erica Mitchell to write fan fiction that would turn into 50 Shades of Grey. There we go. I told you they were directly linked.